Captain Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching the sun rise over Nellis Air Force Base. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly before her, but her eyes were fixed on the sleek gray fighter jet that would either make or break her career. The F-22 Raptor sat like a predator waiting to strike, its angular surfaces reflecting the morning light. "You sure you can handle that bird, rookie?" Staff Sergeant Williams called out, his voice carrying across the flight line. The mechanics around him chuckled, their laughter cutting through the desert air like broken glass. Sarah had heard it all before, the whispers, the doubts, the barely concealed smirks when she walked past the ready room. At 28, Sarah was older than most new F-22 pilots, but that didn't matter to her critics. What mattered was that she had transferred from transport aircraft, cargo planes that her fellow pilots dismissively called trash haulers. In their minds, flying supplies and personnel was a world away from piloting the most advanced fighter jet ever built. They saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their elite circle. The truth was more complicated. Sarah had logged over 3,000 flight hours in C-130 Hercules aircraft, flying dangerous missions into hostile territory across 3 different combat zones. She had landed on improvised airstrips under enemy fire, navigated through sandstorms that could blind a pilot in seconds, and kept her cool when surface-to-air missiles lit up the sky around her transport. But none of that seemed to matter here. Colonel James Henderson, the squadron commander, had made his position clear during Sarah's first briefing. "Martinez, I don't know what strings you pulled to get this assignment, but my F-22 squadron isn't a training ground for cargo pilots looking for excitement. You'll start with basic flight operations and work your way up, if you can cut it." The other pilots had been even less welcoming. Captain Mike Viper Thompson, the squadron's golden boy with 15 confirmed air-to-air victories, had cornered her in the mess hall on her second day. "Listen, transport girl, this isn't about moving boxes from point A to point B. This is about life and death at Mach 2. Maybe you should stick to what you know before someone gets hurt." But Sarah hadn't requested this transfer to prove anything to anyone else. She had done it to prove something to herself. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had always dreamed of flying fighters. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had filled her childhood with stories of aerial combat and the brotherhood of fighter pilots. When she joined the Air Force, though, her scores had landed her in transport command, not tactical aviation. For 8 years, she had excelled at her job while secretly harboring the dream of climbing into a fighter cockpit. When the opportunity finally came, a special program to cross-train experienced pilots into the F-22 program, she had jumped at it despite knowing she would be starting over at the bottom of the hierarchy. The training had been brutal. Sarah spent 18-hour days studying avionics systems, weapons protocols, and combat tactics. While other pilots went home to their families, she remained in the simulator, practicing intercepts and dogfighting techniques until her eyes burned and her hands cramped. The instructors pushed her harder than the younger pilots, seemingly determined to wash her out. "You're too old for this, Martinez," one instructor had told her bluntly. "Fighter pilots need quick reflexes and split-second decision-making. Transport flying makes you soft, makes you think too much instead of reacting." Sarah had bitten back her response and doubled down on her training. She knew that every mistake would be magnified. Every hesitation would be seen as proof that she didn't belong. The pressure was suffocating, but she refused to quit. Now, 3 months into her assignment, she was finally getting her chance to fly a real mission. Intelligence had detected an enemy formation conducting training exercises near the border, a perfect opportunity for her squadron to practice interception tactics. It would be Sarah's first time flying combat air patrol in the F-22, and everyone expected her to struggle. As she walked toward her aircraft, Sarah could feel the eyes of the ground crew following her. Some looked curious, others skeptical. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, handed her the mission briefing with a neutral expression that didn't reveal his thoughts. "Weather's clear, ma'am. Winds are calm. Your bird's ready to fly," he said professionally. But Sarah caught the slight emphasis on "your," a reminder that she was still considered an outsider. The briefing room had been tense earlier that morning. Colonel Henderson had outlined the mission parameters while Sarah sat in the back row, acutely aware of the empty seats around her. The other pilots had clustered together, their easy camaraderie highlighting her isolation. "Martinez, You'll be flying tail-end Charlie on this one, the colonel had announced, assigning her to the least challenging position in the formation. Stay in formation, follow your flight lead, and try not to get in the way. Captain Thompson had turned to look at her with a smug expression. Don't worry, transport girl. We'll keep an eye on you up there. Just stick to the plan and everything will be fine. But as Sarah climbed into her F-22's cockpit, strapping herself into the ejection seat and beginning her pre-flight checks, she felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was what she had trained for, what she had sacrificed for. The doubters and critics faded away as she focused on the task ahead. The F-22's engine spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with commanding such raw power. As her aircraft lifted off from Nellis, she marveled at the Raptor's responsiveness. Every input translated instantly into motion, making the massive fighter feel like an extension of her own body. Ghost Rider flight. Check in, came the voice of Major Tom Razor Phillips, the flight leader, over the radio. Ghost Rider 2. Check, responded Captain Thompson from his position as wingman. Ghost Rider 3. Check, called out Lieutenant Jake Boom Morrison, the squadron's newest pilot before Sarah's arrival. Ghost Rider 4. Check, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the significance of the moment. This was her first real mission with the squadron, and she knew everyone was listening for any sign of nervousness or uncertainty. As they climbed to 30,000 feet and headed toward the training area, Sarah ran through her systems checks one final time. The F-22's advanced avionics suite displayed a crystal-clear picture of the airspace around them, with friendly aircraft shown in blue and the exercise area marked in yellow. Everything was functioning perfectly, but 20 minutes into the flight, things began to change. Sarah's radar warning receiver started chirping, a sound that made her blood run cold. Multiple contacts were appearing on her scope, coming from the northeast at high speed. These weren't the expected training targets. Ghost Rider Lead 4 here. I'm showing multiple fast movers inbound from 040. Altitude unknown. Speed indicating Mach 1.8 and climbing, Sarah transmitted, her training overriding any hesitation. Ghost Rider 4. You're seeing ghosts, Major Phillips replied dismissively. We're in a controlled training environment. Those are probably just atmospheric returns or system glitches, first-timer nerves. But Sarah's experience in combat zones had taught her to trust her instruments even when others doubted them. During her transport years, she had learned to read radar signatures like a book. Enemy fighters had a distinctive pattern that was impossible to fake. What she was seeing now matched exactly what she had encountered over hostile territory. Negative lead. These contacts are real aircraft, and they're not following any training schedule I'm aware of, Sarah insisted, her voice remaining calm but firm. Recommend we investigate and verify. Captain Thompson's voice crackled over the radio with barely concealed irritation. Martinez, you're reading your scope wrong. We've been flying these missions for years. Stand down and follow orders. The contacts were getting closer now, and Sarah could see from their formation and approach vector that they were definitely not friendly training aircraft. Her heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady on the controls. In transport aircraft, she had learned that survival often depended on being the first to spot trouble and react appropriately. Ghost Rider Lead 4 has visual confirmation of incoming aircraft. Count 16, possibly 18 contacts in attack formation. These are not exercise participants, Sarah transmitted, her voice taking on the urgent but controlled tone she had used countless times when calling out threats during combat flights. Major Phillips finally took her seriously enough to check his own radar. The skepticism in his voice was replaced by concern, as he confirmed what Sarah had been seeing for the past 5 minutes. Copy, Ghost Rider 4. All aircraft, this is Lead. We have unidentified contacts approaching from the northeast. Switching to combat air patrol protocols. What Sarah had spotted was an entire enemy squadron conducting what appeared to be a probing mission along the border. Intelligence later revealed that they had been testing American response times and radar coverage, but in the moment all the pilots knew was that they were facing a force nearly 4 times their size. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah, the beginner, who supposedly couldn't read her instruments properly, had been the first to identify a genuine threat that the experienced fighter pilots had dismissed as equipment malfunction. Colonel Henderson's voice came over, the radio from ground control, his tone serious and professional. Ghost Rider flight, you are cleared to intercept. Rules of engagement are in effect. Do not let those aircraft penetrate our airspace. As the 4 F-22s turned to meet the incoming threat, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that came with real combat. But there was something else too, a cold determination that had been building inside her for months. Every dismissive comment, every skeptical look, every time she had been treated as less than equal had been fuel for this moment. Captain Thompson was already maneuvering for an intercept, his F-22 pulling a tight turn that showcased the aircraft's incredible agility. "Don't worry, transport girl," he called over the radio. "Just stay back and watch how it's done." But Sarah wasn't planning to stay back. Her years of flying in contested airspace had taught her patience and situational awareness, qualities that were about to prove invaluable. While the other pilots focused on the most obvious targets at the front of the enemy formation, Sarah had noticed something that they had missed. 3 enemy aircraft had separated from the main group and were attempting a flanking maneuver, climbing high and wide to position themselves for an attack on the American fighters from an unexpected angle. It was a classic tactical move that Sarah had seen enemy pilots attempt against her transport aircraft and their fighter escorts. "Ghost Rider lead, 4 here. I have 3 bandits attempting to flank us from the south. They're climbing through 35,000 feet and appear to be setting up for a high-side attack," Sarah reported, her voice cutting through the radio chatter with absolute clarity. Major Phillips acknowledged her call, but he was already engaged with the main enemy formation and couldn't break off to deal with the flanking aircraft. The same was true for Thompson and Morrison. They were all committed to their current intercepts. "Ghost Rider 4, you have the flankers. Take them down," came the order that Sarah had been waiting her entire career to hear. This was it, her chance to prove that she belonged in the cockpit of America's most advanced fighter aircraft. Sarah banked her F-22 hard to the left, the G-forces pushing her deep into her seat as she climbed to intercept the flanking enemy aircraft. Her years of experience in high-stress situations kicked in automatically. Her breathing remained controlled, her vision stayed focused, and her hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had flown through countless dangerous situations. The 3 enemy fighters were climbing fast, trying to gain altitude advantage before the American pilots could react to their maneuver. Sarah could see on her tactical display that they were flying a sophisticated intercept pattern, with 1 aircraft acting as bait, while the other 2 positioned themselves for killing shots on her squadron mates below. "Contact, contact," she heard Captain Thompson shout over the radio as he engaged the main enemy formation. The professional calm in his voice had been replaced by the sharp urgency of combat. "Multiple bandits inbound, weapons free." But Sarah forced herself to ignore the radio chatter and focus on her own targets. This was exactly the kind of situation her transport experience had prepared her for. While cargo aircraft couldn't fight back directly, their pilots had to maintain perfect situational awareness and make split-second decisions while under fire. The ability to stay calm while chaos erupted around her was something Sarah had learned the hard way. The lead enemy fighter broke left as soon as he detected Sarah's approach, but she had anticipated the move. During her years flying transports, she had watched enemy pilots use this exact tactic dozens of times. Instead of following him into the turn, she pulled her F-22 into a vertical climb, using the Raptor's incredible thrust-to-weight ratio to position herself above the enemy formation. "Come on," she whispered to herself, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The enemy pilots were good, but they were flying older aircraft that couldn't match the F-22's performance envelope. Sarah had the advantage of superior technology, but more importantly, she had patience, something that years of flying defensive missions had taught her. The second enemy fighter made the mistake she was waiting for. Seeing Sarah climb above them, he pulled his aircraft into a steep ascent to meet her head-on. It was an aggressive move that showed skill and confidence, but it also exposed his aircraft's belly to attack from below. Sarah rolled inverted and dove, her F-22 screaming downward at over 600 knots. The enemy pilot tried to follow her maneuver, but his aircraft couldn't match the Raptor's instantaneous turn rate. Sarah pulled out of her dive directly behind him, the perfect firing position that fighter pilots called 6 o'clock. "Fox 2, she called out, announcing her missile launch over the radio. The AIM-9X Sidewinder leaped off her aircraft's rail and streaked toward the enemy fighter with deadly accuracy. The pilot tried to break away, deploying chaff and flares in a desperate attempt to confuse the missile's seeker head. But Sarah had fired from too close a range. The Sidewinder's impact was devastating. The first enemy aircraft was eliminated, but Sarah had no time to celebrate. The remaining 2 fighters had regrouped and were now converging on her position from opposite directions, a classic pincer movement designed to force her to choose which threat to engage while leaving herself vulnerable to the other. This was the moment that separated good pilots from great ones. Sarah's transport experience had taught her that sometimes the best defense was an unexpected offense. Instead of trying to evade both aircraft or picking one to fight while running from the other, she did something that caught both enemy pilots completely off guard. She turned directly toward the closer of the 2 fighters and accelerated to maximum speed. The F-22's twin engines pushed her aircraft past Mach 1.5 as she bore down on the enemy like a missile herself. The opposing pilot, expecting Sarah to try to escape or maneuver defensively, was caught completely unprepared for such an aggressive frontal attack. The enemy fighter broke right, but Sarah had anticipated the move and was already pulling her F-22 through a brutal 9G turn to follow. The tremendous forces pressed her down into her seat and made her vision tunnel, but her years of physical conditioning and combat experience allowed her to maintain control. "Fox 2, she called again as her second Sidewinder left the rail. This shot was even easier than the first. The enemy pilot's evasive maneuver had actually brought him into Sarah's engagement envelope. The missile found its mark with mechanical precision, 2 down, 1 to go. But the third enemy fighter was the most dangerous of the group. Sarah could see from his flight pattern that this pilot was experienced and cautious. He had watched her eliminate his wingmen and was now maneuvering carefully, trying to force Sarah into a sustained dogfight where his experience might overcome her technological advantage. For several long minutes, the 2 aircraft danced through the sky in a deadly ballet of thrust and turn. The enemy pilot was skilled, using every trick in the book to try to gain position on Sarah's F-22. He flew his aircraft to its absolute limits, pulling maximum G-forces and using his fighters' agility to stay competitive with the superior Raptor. But Sarah had learned something during her transport years that fighter pilots often overlooked. Patience was a weapon. While her opponent was burning fuel and energy trying to force a quick kill, Sarah was conserving her resources and waiting for the right opportunity. The enemy pilot made his fatal mistake when he tried to extend the fight by diving toward the ground, hoping to use terrain masking to break Sarah's radar lock. It was a sound tactic against most fighters, but the F-22's advanced radar system could track targets even in ground clutter. Sarah followed him down, staying just outside his aircraft's turn radius while maintaining perfect firing position. When the enemy fighter pulled up from his dive in a desperate attempt to escape, Sarah was ready. Her third and final missile of the engagement struck home with devastating effect. "Splash 3, she reported calmly over the radio, using the standard terminology for confirmed kills. "Flanking threat eliminated." The radio exploded with chatter as her squadron mates acknowledged her success, but Sarah barely heard them. She was already scanning her radar scope for new threats and checking her fuel status. The main battle was still raging below, and her fellow pilots needed all the help they could get. As Sarah turned her attention to the main battle below, she could see that her squadron mates were in serious trouble. The enemy had used their numerical advantage to split the American formation, and now each F-22 was fighting multiple opponents simultaneously. The radio chatter had become increasingly urgent as the pilots called out threats and tried to coordinate their defensive maneuvers. "Ghost Rider 2 is engaged with 4 bandits." Captain Thompson's voice came over the radio, the stress evident despite his professional training. "I need help down here." Major Phillips was in an even worse situation, locked in a turning fight with 5 enemy aircraft while trying to maintain command and control of the scattered American formation. "Ghost Rider lead is defensive. Repeat, defensive," he called out, using the code word that indicated he was being hunted rather than hunting. Sarah assessed the tactical situation with the cool, analytical mind that had kept her alive during hundreds of transport missions in hostile territory. The enemy had achieved exactly what they wanted. They had drawn the American fighters into individual dogfights, where superior numbers could overwhelm superior technology. But Sarah had an advantage that none of the other pilots possessed. Her transport experience had taught her to think beyond individual aircraft survival and consider the broader tactical picture. While fighter pilots were trained to engage and destroy enemy aircraft, transport pilots were trained to complete the mission while keeping everyone alive. Looking at the battle from above, Sarah could see a pattern that the pilots in the thick of the fight couldn't observe. The enemy aircraft were operating in coordinated pairs, with one fighter engaging the Americans head-on, while another maneuvered for a flanking attack. It was effective, but it was also predictable once you recognized the pattern. Sarah keyed her radio with calm authority. "All Ghost Rider aircraft, this is 4. I'm observing coordinated attacks from above. Enemy aircraft are working in pairs, one engaging, one flanking. Recommend defensive spiral climb to break their coordination." "-4, Major Phillips replied sharply. "Maintain combat air patrol and stay clear of the engagement area. This is no time for transport tactics." But even as he rejected her advice, Sarah could see that the current approach wasn't working. Captain Thompson was being forced lower and lower as multiple enemy fighters pressed their attack, and Lieutenant Morrison had already expended most of his missiles without achieving any kills. The American formation was being systematically destroyed. Sarah made a decision that would either save her squadron or end her career. Instead of following orders to stay clear of the main battle, she dove her F-22 directly into the center of the enemy formation. It was a calculated risk based on her assessment of enemy tactics and her own aircraft's capabilities. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sarah's sudden appearance disrupted the carefully coordinated enemy attack patterns, forcing multiple aircraft to break off their attacks on her squadron mates to deal with this new threat. It was exactly what she had hoped would happen. "What the hell are you doing, Martinez?" Captain Thompson shouted over the radio as he saw Sarah's F-22 screaming past his canopy at high speed. "Saving your life," Sarah replied calmly as she selected her 4th missile and locked onto an enemy fighter that had been maneuvering for a killing shot on Thompson's aircraft. The enemy pilot never saw the threat coming. His attention was focused entirely on the F-22 he had been stalking. "Fox 2, Sarah called out as her missile found its target. The enemy aircraft disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris, and suddenly Captain Thompson was free to maneuver defensively instead of running for his life. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her dramatic entrance into the battle had created chaos in the enemy formation, and she intended to exploit that confusion to maximum advantage. Using techniques she had learned from watching fighter escorts defend her transport aircraft, she began a systematic attack on the enemy formation's coordination. Instead of trying to engage every enemy fighter individually, Sarah targeted the aircraft that were acting as coordinators and wingmen. Each time she eliminated one of these supporting aircraft, an entire enemy pair would become disorganized and vulnerable to attack from her squadron mates. The tide of battle began to turn as Sarah's unconventional tactics took effect. Major Phillips found himself with breathing room to re-establish command and control of the American formation. Lieutenant Morrison was able to reposition for effective missile shots instead of constantly defending against attacks from multiple directions. "I don't believe it," Captain Thompson muttered over the radio as he watched Sarah systematically dismantling the enemy formation structure. "Transport Girl is teaching us how to fight." Sarah ignored the comment and continued her methodical destruction of enemy coordination. Her 5th kill came when she caught an enemy fighter pilot fixated on Major Phillips, completely unaware that Sarah was approaching from his blind spot. The 6th kill followed seconds later as she eliminated the first aircraft's wingman before he could react to his partner's destruction. The enemy formation, which had held such a commanding advantage just minutes earlier, began to collapse as their carefully planned tactics fell apart under Sarah's assault. Enemy pilots found themselves isolated and outnumbered as Sarah's disruption tactics allowed the other American fighters to regroup and coordinate their own attacks. "Ghost Rider 4, this is lead," Major Phillips called over the radio, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "Survival school, sir," Sarah replied as she lined up her 7th shot of the engagement. 3 years flying transports in hostile airspace teaches you to recognize attack patterns and how to break them up. The 7th missile flew true, eliminating another enemy fighter and leaving the remaining hostile aircraft in complete disarray. The pilots who had entered the engagement with such confidence were now scattered across the sky, trying desperately to regroup while being hunted by the very American fighters they had expected to destroy. The remaining enemy aircraft were now in full retreat, but their escape route took them directly through Sarah's position. She had positioned her F-22 perfectly to intercept the fleeing fighters, drawing on her experience with defensive positioning from her transport days. What had once been an overwhelming enemy advantage had become a rout. Ghost Rider 4 has multiple targets fleeing northeast, Sarah reported calmly, her voice steady despite having just engaged in the most intense aerial combat of her career. Request permission to pursue. Permission granted, Major Phillips responded immediately. The skepticism that had colored his earlier communications had been replaced by professional respect. Clean them up, 4. Sarah's 8th kill came as she caught a fleeing enemy fighter trying to use a cloud bank for concealment. The pilot was skilled, but he was flying predictably, using the same evasion tactics that Sarah had observed countless times during her transport missions. She anticipated his exit from the clouds and was waiting with a perfectly positioned shot. The 9th kill followed quickly as another enemy fighter tried to defend his wingman. The pilot's loyalty was commendable, but his tactical decision was flawed. By turning back to engage Sarah's F-22, he had given up the energy advantage he needed to escape and had positioned himself perfectly for Sarah's attack. As word of the engagement spread through the American formation, Sarah could hear the amazement in her squadron mates' voices. The woman they had dismissed as an inexperienced transport pilot was systematically destroying an enemy force that had initially outnumbered them 4-1. Martinez has 9 confirmed kills. Lieutenant Morrison reported to ground control, his voice filled with disbelief. Say again. Ghost Rider 4 has 9 confirmed kills and is still engaging. Colonel Henderson's voice crackled over the radio from the command center, his tone reflecting the shock that everyone was feeling. Confirm that count, Ghost Rider flight. Did you say 9 kills for a single pilot? Affirmative, sir, Major Phillips replied. Ghost Rider 4 has single-handedly eliminated more than half of the enemy formation and turned the entire battle around. I've never seen flying like this, but Sarah wasn't finished. Her tactical analysis of the battle had revealed that several enemy aircraft were attempting to regroup at low altitude, hoping to use terrain masking to avoid the American fighters' radar systems. It was a sound defensive tactic, but Sarah had seen it used before during her transport missions. She dove her F-22 toward the deck, using the aircraft's incredible power-to-weight ratio to accelerate past Mach 1.8 in a vertical descent. The enemy pilots below thought they were safe in the radar shadow of the mountains, but they hadn't counted on a direct visual attack from above. Sarah's 10th kill came as she caught an enemy fighter completely by surprise, the pilot never realizing that death was diving toward him at supersonic speed. Her 11th followed seconds later as she pulled out of her dive and engaged the dead pilot's wingman before he could react to the threat. The remaining enemy aircraft scattered in all directions, their formation completely shattered. What had begun as a coordinated attack by an elite enemy squadron had become a desperate survival situation as individual pilots tried to escape the American fighters. This is impossible, Captain Thompson muttered over the radio as he watched Sarah eliminate her 12th target. No pilot gets 12 kills in a single engagement. The fuel consumption alone should have grounded her by now. But Sarah's transport experience had taught her fuel management techniques that fighter pilots rarely considered. While her squadron mates had been burning fuel at maximum afterburner settings during their individual dogfights, Sarah had been using her aircraft's superior aerodynamics and her own tactical patience to conserve energy and maintain combat effectiveness. Her 13th kill came as she intercepted an enemy fighter trying to escape at low altitude. The pilot was flying desperately, pulling his aircraft through violent maneuvers in an attempt to shake Sarah's pursuit. But Sarah had learned patience from years of flying defensive missions, and she waited for the perfect shot before firing. Ghost Rider 4, this is command. Colonel Henderson's voice carried an undertone of amazement that he was trying to suppress. You are approaching fuel bingo. Recommend you return to base for refueling and rearming. Negative, Command, Sarah replied calmly. I still have ordnance remaining and sufficient fuel for engagement. There are still hostiles in the area that need to be eliminated. The 14th kill came as Sarah caught an enemy pilot trying to use a classic defensive maneuver. Split S-turn that reversed the aircraft's direction while diving to pick up speed. It was a textbook evasion technique, but Sarah had seen it used so many times during her transport years that she could predict exactly where the enemy aircraft would emerge from the maneuver. By now, the radio chatter had taken on an almost surreal quality, as the other pilots struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The woman they had labeled as a beginner was demonstrating a level of tactical awareness and combat effectiveness that veteran fighter pilots found almost impossible to believe. I count 14 confirmed kills for Ghost Rider 4. Lieutenant Morrison reported to ground control. The enemy formation is completely destroyed. Repeat, the hostile formation has been eliminated. Sarah was already scanning her radar for any remaining threats, but the scope was clean except for the friendly aircraft in her own formation. The enemy force that had approached with such confidence had been systematically destroyed by the pilot her own squadron had considered least qualified for combat. All Ghost Rider aircraft. This is 4, Sarah transmitted calmly. Airspace is clear of hostiles. Recommend we reform and return to base. The silence on the radio was deafening as her squadron mates struggled to process what had just happened. The flight back to Nellis Air Force Base was conducted in stunned silence. Sarah maintained perfect formation discipline, but she could feel the eyes of her squadron mates on her aircraft as they processed what they had just witnessed. The woman they had dismissed as an incompetent beginner had just achieved the most decisive aerial victory in the squadron's history. As the 4 F-22 Raptors touched down on the Nevada runway, Sarah could see that word of the engagement had already spread throughout the base. Ground crews and pilots from other squadrons had gathered along the flight line, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. 14 confirmed kills in a single engagement was the stuff of legend, not routine training missions. Colonel Henderson was waiting on the tarmac as Sarah shut down her engines and began her post-flight checks. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah could sense the intensity of his scrutiny as she climbed down from her aircraft. The other pilots were already gathering around, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by something approaching awe. Captain Martinez, Colonel Henderson began, his voice carefully controlled. I need a detailed debriefing of that engagement. What I'm hearing over the radio doesn't match anything in our tactical manuals. Sarah nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. I'll be happy to explain my tactical decisions. Captain Thompson approached with his helmet tucked under his arm, his earlier arrogance completely absent. Martinez, I owe you an apology. You saved my life up there. That flanking maneuver you intercepted would have killed me before I even knew what hit me. Major Phillips joined the group, shaking his head in amazement. I've been flying fighters for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Where did you learn to read enemy formations like that? Transport missions, sir, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. When you're flying cargo aircraft through hostile territory, you learn to recognize attack patterns very quickly. Your survival depends on spotting threats before they develop into actual attacks. Lieutenant Morrison looked confused. But transport aircraft don't fight back. How does that translate to air-to-air combat? Sarah considered her response carefully. She had spent years watching fighter escorts defend her transport flights, observing their tactics from a unique perspective that pure fighter pilots never experienced. When you're flying defensive missions, you see the complete tactical picture. You watch how enemy aircraft coordinate their attacks, how they position themselves, what their weaknesses are. Fighter pilots usually only see their immediate targets, but transport pilots have to understand the entire battle. The debriefing session lasted for 3 hours, as Sarah walked the squadron commanders through every decision she had made during the engagement. Her tactical analysis was unlike anything they had heard before. Instead of focusing on individual aircraft performance and weapons employment, she described the battle in terms of formation dynamics and enemy coordination. The enemy was using a standard hunter-killer pattern, Sarah explained, pointing to the tactical display. One aircraft would engage our fighters head-on to fix their attention, while his wingman would maneuver for a flanking attack. By disrupting the coordination between the paired aircraft, I was able to isolate individual targets and eliminate them systematically. Colonel Henderson studied the flight data recordings with growing amazement. Your fuel consumption was 40% lower than standard engagement protocols. How did you maintain combat effectiveness while conserving energy? Patience, sir, Sarah replied. Fighter pilots are trained to be aggressive, to seize the initiative and press attacks home quickly. But sometimes the best tactic is to wait for the enemy to make mistakes and then exploit their errors. Transport flying teaches you that survival often depends on defensive thinking, rather than offensive action. The intelligence briefing that followed revealed the true significance of Sarah's victory. The enemy formation she had destroyed represented an entire elite squadron, pilots with years of combat experience flying some of the most advanced aircraft in their nation's inventory. The loss of such experienced aviators and sophisticated equipment was a devastating blow to enemy capabilities. Captain Martinez, the intelligence officer, reported, "Preliminary analysis indicates that you eliminated at least 6 enemy aces during today's engagement." These were not training pilots. They were combat veterans with dozens of kills between them. The news sent shockwaves through the squadron. Destroying experienced enemy pilots was far more significant than simply shooting down aircraft. Each of the pilots Sarah had eliminated represented years of training and combat experience that could never be replaced. Word of Sarah's achievement spread rapidly throughout the Air Force community. By evening, phone calls were pouring in from Pentagon officials, combat commands around the world, and military analysts trying to understand how a single pilot had achieved such an unprecedented victory. The tactical lessons from the engagement would be studied for years to come. But the most significant change was in the attitude of Sarah's own squadron. The pilots who had treated her as an outsider just hours earlier were now seeking her advice on combat tactics and formation flying. The woman they had labeled as a beginner had become their most experienced combat pilot overnight. Captain Thompson found Sarah in the squadron ready room that evening, reviewing gun camera footage from the engagement. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did up there," he said quietly. "But I also wanted to ask you something. Why didn't you tell us about your combat experience? All those transport missions you flew. You were in harm's way constantly, weren't you?" Sarah looked up from the video display, her expression thoughtful. "Nobody asked," she replied simply. "Everyone assumed that transport flying was safe, that we just moved cargo from point A to point B without any real danger. The truth is, we flew into hot landing zones almost every day. We just couldn't shoot back." The realization was sobering for Thompson and the other fighter pilots who had gathered to listen. They had dismissed Sarah's experience because it didn't involve air-to-air combat, never considering that flying defensively through hostile territory might actually provide superior tactical awareness compared to aggressive fighter missions. "Major," Phillips approached with a folder of official documents. "Sarah, I have some news. Command has fast-tracked your promotion to Major, effective immediately. They're also assigning you as the new squadron tactical officer. Apparently, there's a lot of interest in your unconventional approach to air combat." Sarah accepted the promotion with quiet dignity, but she could see the respect in her commanding officer's eyes. The same man who had questioned her qualifications just that morning was now looking to her for tactical leadership. Colonel Henderson joined the group with additional news that would reshape Sarah's entire career. "Major Martinez, I've just received orders from Air Combat Command. They want you to develop a new training program that incorporates your defensive tactics into standard fighter pilot education. It seems that your transport experience has revealed some significant gaps in our current combat doctrine." The irony was not lost on anyone present. The pilot they had considered least qualified to fly fighters was now being asked to teach the entire Air Force how to fight more effectively. Sarah's unique perspective, combining transport defensive tactics with fighter aircraft capabilities, and had created a revolutionary approach to air combat that military planners were eager to adopt. As the evening progressed and the squadron celebrated their victory, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. Her years of being dismissed and underestimated had actually been preparation for something greater than she had ever imagined. The skills that others had seen as limitations had become her greatest strengths. The phone call that changed everything came just before midnight. Sarah was summoned to Colonel Henderson's office, where he waited with a secure telephone connection to the Pentagon. On the other end of the line was General Patricia Williams, the Air Force's highest-ranking combat officer. "Major Martinez," the general's voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded air operations around the world. "Your performance today has attracted attention at the highest levels of the Defense Department. We want to offer you something that's never been offered to a pilot with your background." 6 months later, Major Sarah Martinez stood before an auditorium filled with the Air Force's most elite pilots. The weapons school at Nellis Air Force Base had invited her to present the keynote address at their annual symposium on air combat evolution. The same institution that had once questioned her qualifications was now showcasing her revolutionary tactics to the world's finest aviators. The transformation in Sarah's career had been nothing short of meteoric. The Pentagon assignment that General Williams had offered her involved leading a new tactical development program that combined defensive awareness with offensive capabilities. Sarah's unique perspective had identified fundamental flaws in traditional fighter pilot training that had gone unnoticed for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, addressing the assembled pilots, "6 months ago, many of you would have dismissed me as an unqualified transport pilot who didn't belong in a fighter cockpit. Today I want to talk about why that kind of thinking almost cost us a war." The audience listened with rapt attention as Sarah outlined her analysis of the engagement that had made her famous. Her presentation wasn't about individual heroics or superior flying skills. It was about the critical importance of tactical awareness and the dangers of dismissing experience that came from unconventional sources. The enemy formation we encountered that day was using tactics that fighter pilots had never seen before, but transport pilots knew intimately, Sarah explained. By focusing exclusively on offensive training, our combat doctrine had created a blind spot that nearly proved fatal. Tactical innovations that emerged from Sarah's program were being implemented throughout the Air Force and shared with allied nations around the world. Her emphasis on defensive awareness and formation dynamics had revolutionized how fighter pilots were trained and how air battles were fought. Colonel Henderson, who had since been promoted to brigadier general, introduced Sarah to the audience with words that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. "Major Martinez has achieved something that military historians will study for generations. She has proven that experience and wisdom can trump conventional expectations, and that the most valuable insights sometimes come from the most unexpected sources." The audience included many of the pilots who had initially dismissed Sarah's capabilities. Captain Thompson, now one of her most dedicated students, sat in the front row taking detailed notes on her presentation. The transformation in his attitude reflected a broader change throughout the fighter pilot community. "The lesson here isn't about my individual achievement," Sarah continued. "It's about the importance of recognizing valuable experience wherever it comes from. Every pilot in this room has knowledge and insights that could revolutionize how we fight. The question is whether we're humble enough to listen and learn from each other." The statistical impact of Sarah's tactical innovations was undeniable. Pilot survival rates in training exercises had increased by 40%, and mission success rates had improved dramatically. Her defensive awareness protocols were being adopted by air forces around the world, fundamentally changing how aerial combat was conducted. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Sarah's success had shattered the stereotypes and prejudices that had limited the Air Force's ability to recognize and develop talent from unconventional sources. Her story had become a powerful example of how diversity of experience could strengthen military effectiveness. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by a young female pilot who reminded her of herself just months earlier. Lieutenant Jennifer Park had recently transferred from Transport Command and was facing the same skepticism and dismissal that Sarah had endured. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Park said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for proving that transport pilots can succeed in fighters. The other pilots in my squadron keep telling me I don't belong here, that I should go back to flying cargo." Sarah smiled, remembering her own struggles with self-doubt and the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of respect. "Lieutenant, let me tell you something that took me years to understand. Your transport experience isn't a limitation. It's a unique strength that gives you perspectives other pilots don't have. Don't let anyone convince you that different means inferior." The conversation reminded Sarah of how far she had traveled from that morning on the tarmac at Nellis, when she had been dismissed as an inexperienced beginner. The woman who had once been labeled as unqualified was now mentoring the next generation of pilots and revolutionizing air combat doctrine. As the symposium concluded, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. Her success hadn't come from conforming to expectations or following traditional paths. It had come from embracing her unique background and having the courage to trust her own experience even when others doubted her. The phone in her office rang as she returned from the symposium. It was General Williams with news that would take Sarah's career in yet another unexpected direction. "Major Martinez, we have a new challenge for you. The Navy's Top Gun program has requested your assistance in developing their own defensive awareness curriculum. It seems your reputation has spread beyond the Air Force." Sarah accepted the assignment with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through every challenge in her career. The woman who had once been considered least likely to succeed in air combat was now being asked to train the military's most elite pilots. The story that had begun with dismissal and doubt had become a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of recognizing value in unexpected places. Sarah Martinez had not only proved her critics wrong, she had fundamentally changed how the military thought about talent, experience, and the many different paths that could lead to excellence. Her 14 kills in a single engagement would be remembered as a historic achievement, but her greater legacy lay in the countless pilots whose lives would be saved by the tactical innovation she had developed. The beginner who had been labeled as inadequate had become a teacher whose lessons would protect aviators for generations to come.